Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Samir Boray. I'm a senior policy manager at the Information Technology Industry Council, or ITI. ITI is a global tech trade association that represents 80 of the most innovative tech companies. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C., with offices in Brussels, New Delhi, and Singapore. I'm pleased to moderate today's panel on US policy to accelerate quantum technologies. Over the course of this conference, we've heard how quantum technologies are evolving rapidly and moving closer to real world deployment across computing, sensing, and secure communications. This panel is not about reiterating the science or that promise, it's about the policy. Specifically, what must the US government do now to ensure that its policy frameworks are ready to support responsible quantum innovation and long term global leadership? We'll dig into what that requires in terms of strategic federal investment, secure infrastructure, and international engagement, and examine how proactive policymaking can lay the groundwork for leadership rather than simply keeping pace with industry developments. I'm joined by these three leaders who sit at the intersection of policy and quantum tech. Jasmine Schlichting from Keysight Technologies, Emily Violi from Microsoft, and John Miller from ITI. Each brings a unique vantage point on how policy is both enabling and constraining progress in this field. Let's begin by having each of you briefly introduce yourselves and your work in the quantum space. We can start with Jasmine and then I'll continue.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Schlichting. I'm the head of quantum go-to-market for Keysight Technologies. Keysight is a Fortune 500 design, test, and measurement company. We're most recently notable for installing the world's largest quantum control system at AIST in Japan, which is a 1,000-qubit system. But Keysight has hundreds of products in the portfolio, and I think one of the really fun parts of my job is that any product from oscilloscope to wafer test to EDA, if it's applied in a quantum way, that falls in our quantum group. And I'll pass it to Emily.
Thanks, Jasmine. And thank you, Samir and ITI, for having us for this discussion. My name is Emily Violi. I'm the program manager for legal and policy supporting Microsoft's quantum program. Microsoft has been working on quantum innovation for the past 20 years. One of my favorite facts is that it's actually the longest running research program at the company. And we're focused on every layer of the quantum stack. Microsoft is a platform company, and that's the approach that we've taken with quantum as well. We have deep first-party hardware efforts. We have deep third-party collaboration efforts on hardware as well. We're focused on the quantum software layer. And in terms of use cases, we believe that at least the early use cases will be in scientific innovation, specifically in chemistry and material science. And we also believe that the future of quantum is hybrid. So that convergence of classical HPC, the AI innovation that we're seeing today, and now future quantum technologies as well, that's what's going to be extremely powerful. And as our CEO, Satya Nadella, said at our most recent earnings call, we believe that the next big accelerator for the cloud will be quantum computing. So super happy to be here with all of you today. It's a fascinating policy area, so happy to discuss.
My name is John Miller, Senior Vice President of Policy and General Counsel at ITI. I lead our Trust Data and Technology Policy team. So that includes really a lot of tech policy, cybersecurity, privacy, data, telecommunications policy, also certainly AI and emerging technologies such as quantum. Just maybe one additional word about ITI. We represent 80 technology companies, really from all up and down the tech stack, and several with quantum equities, including Keysight and Microsoft, for sure. The other thing that's really important, even though we're focused on the U.S. government policy environment here, ITI is a global organization, as Samir mentioned, and we're doing policy work and advocacy all over the globe. And the other thing that we try to do is engage in thought leadership. I do want to put in a plug for our the quantum policy guide that we published earlier this year. It's available on our website. itic.org. It's kind of 101 level education for policymakers, plus actionable recommendations for what we believe quantum policy should look like, and hopefully we'll have a chance to get into a bunch of those during the course of the discussion. Turn it back to you, Samir.
Thanks for those introductions. Let's begin by looking at the policy tools that can help bridge research and real-world deployment. So this is for, we can start with Emily. What should be the US government's top near-term and long-term priorities for quantum R&D, and how can we better bridge the gap between lab research and commercial deployment?
Great, thanks, Samir. Can you all hear me? Okay. So I think we can first start by recognizing that given the, acceleration in industry over the past 18 months, whether it's, achievements in error correction, advancements in hardware that we've seen, what were presumed to be long-term priorities are actually becoming closer to nearer-term priorities and are going to require direct action from US policymakers in order to achieve them. And so when we think about our priorities for the next couple of years, next several of years, we have a national imperative to first and foremost accelerate our pathway to a utility scale quantum computer. And at the same time, we have to be thinking about how are we very intentionally building up the US ecosystem around it to be able to take advantage of its capabilities when it arrives. And so we have really two priorities, right? Build the system and build the ecosystem. And through, very close collaboration with industry, I think there is a ton of opportunity for direct government action in order to help us advance both of those priorities. With building the system, as we push towards utility scale, we have to think about how we can fully fund critical government programs that are aimed specifically at that, reaching utility scale quantum computing and the pathway to it. And I think programs like DARPA QBI, DARPA's Quantum Benchmarking Initiative, are providing not just a lot of clarity on what our path towards utility scale and that priority looks like, but are also providing a really helpful model for public-private collaboration through a very rigorous science-backed validation model that I think will be helpful as policymakers think about our path to utility scale going forward. And the second priority, building the ecosystem, I think government has two very intertwined but unique roles that they can take as we look towards the next couple of years. First, I think US policymakers need to be thinking about how the US government can be an early user of these kind of early reliable quantum systems, but also the first customer of a utility scale quantum computer. And that's a really important feedback loop with industry, not just sending a signal to the market, but also helping us better understand within industry what are the use cases that government cares about and how can we accelerate our architecture to be able to support them. And at the same time, being those early users, as I think quantum ecosystem development is a very hot topic, it's been a hot topic over the past kind of 24 hours, how can we think about bringing other stakeholders, academia, industry, all together in a very tech-forward ecosystem, giving them access to the latest and greatest technology to help us build these use cases, the application space, as we look towards the next couple of years. So when I think about where policy should focus, I would really lean in on those two specific priorities.
Jasmine?
I just want to build a little bit off what Emily said around ecosystem. And I think, when we're thinking about bridging the gap between R&D and commercialization, I really think about access. Because right now the people who can access quantum are, academics or in a lab or government, but you have to apply to that program and be accepted, and you have to have all the resources and the knowledge and support that gets you into programs, that gets you access to quantum computers. And if we want to bridge that gap, then there needs to be more access, whether that means that, there's a shared quantum resource at a university or in a public institution, or there's more, quantum cloud efforts, et cetera. I'm not going to sit here and define how we can enable access, but I think more broad access is a key, because right now it's limited to large institutions and academics and some research labs.
Can I maybe just jump in really quick just to add a couple of high-level points, maybe. The one thing is that certainly in our advocacy, that's not quantum related. A lot of times we talk to government policymakers about the need for technology and IT modernization, right? And I think they usually think about it as, well, okay, we're replacing our old computers with new computers. That's not really the way they should be thinking about quantum, right? Because we're going to need integrated solutions with classical computers and quantum computers, number one. And then to just build off what Emily said, the reality, and this is, I know we don't want to rehash other things we've heard over the last couple of days, but during the International Forum yesterday, heard from several governments talking about, the demand signal needs to, and in particular, the reality is that there are certain computational problems that quantum computers are just better at. So really articulating, like if governments can articulate that, it'll just really strengthen the commercial, the business case and the commercialization outlook, I think, in a lot of ways.
Thanks for that. Now let's turn to one of the most urgent policy questions on the horizon: cybersecurity in the post-quantum era. So, John, as someone who has worked in cybersecurity and data policy for many years now, how do you think federal agencies and lawmakers should be thinking about the transition to post-quantum cryptography?
Thanks, Samir. And I know there's been a lot of talk about this topic as well the last couple of days, but there's a really good reason for it. I think, top line, policymakers need to take the known risks related to quantum, specifically in the area of cybersecurity and encryption, very seriously and with urgency, right? I mean, why is that? Okay, and apologies if this is all obvious to everyone in the room. It's not necessarily to policymakers, right? I mean, sometimes when we think about and we talk about technology risks, they're a little bit more speculative and hypothetical and even bordering on science fiction. I mean, some of the AI conversations we've had over the past couple of years, I don't want to minimize the risks at all, but, Terminator and Skynet, I mean, I don't know that we should necessarily be structuring public policy around that risk, right? But, here with quantum, it's a very defined risk, and probably the biggest risk, and that's the fact that a quantum computer can break widely used public key encryption algorithms in kind of a much more reasonable amount of time than a classical computer can, right? So, I've heard it described by various people in different contexts as, it literally could be a weapon of mass cyber destruction. Again, don't want to engage in hyperbole, but if you can break all existing encryption, that is a problem, obviously, and it's particularly a problem for encrypted data at rest, and there's a lot of it sitting out there, right? I mean, you've probably heard in other sessions, harvest now, decrypt later. I mean, that's a real tangible risk. We need trust in our data and systems, and cryptography is a foundational underpinning of cybersecurity and that trust. And so we need to address this. I mean, I think the good news, right, particularly for the U.S. government, but also other governments, is that the U.S. government's done a good job of identifying this risk and taking serious steps to mitigate it with industry. I mean, certainly, I think it was back in 2016, NIST started working on post-quantum cryptography algorithms. Maybe it was even earlier than that. Those standards do now exist. We've seen executive orders and other things, other policy actions in the U.S. kind of demanding that agencies need to start the transition now. So that's the good news. There is a but. This is going to take a while, and it's going to take a lot of money, and it's not necessarily clear that everyone in industry, particularly when we start talking about SMBs and others, shares the awareness of the threat that governments do and that large companies also do. So I think we really just need to governments, I think, to communicate that sense of urgency. Companies need to continue doing what they're doing as well. Governments need to work together. It's not going to be helpful if everyone's taking a different approach and using different standards necessarily, I don't think. And I think just overall, we need to strengthen communication about this issue, and it kind of does. I have been working in cybersecurity for a long time. It does remind me of the earlier days of cyber when people weren't necessarily getting what the cyber risk was all about in the C-suite, and I think that time has luckily passed for cyber, but not for quantum maybe. So I know.
I'd love to build a little bit off of what you mentioned about the different standards not being on an optimal outcome. And something that I found is interesting is the world is looking to NIST to set these PQC standards, and it's kind of defined by NIST, but the U.S. is not being aggressive in the implementation policies, right? Like we see the EU and New Zealand being the first nations, coalitions to have PQC transition standards. And from a practical perspective, I mean, people don't transition until there's a policy or there's a mandate. Big companies and small companies have other priorities. And even if you know intellectually, oh, this is important, like until there's a mandate, like the wheel doesn't start really turning. And so I think something for, a policy perspective is like, we've got to, if we don't want to follow other people's standards, we've got to have more aggressive timelines for transition, because otherwise we're going to be following the EU standards. Because maybe there's a fractured set of standards, but I don't think that's what anyone would like to see.
And if I could add just quickly on the timelines piece, I think that point, like early and progressive transition timelines is so critical and a real opportunity, I think, for U.S. policymakers to lead and be a very vocal advocate for. I think we have a general sense of when cryptographically relevant quantum computers will exist, but at the same time, we're already seeing algorithmic optimization. We're seeing breakthroughs in hardware. That timeline is being pulled up at a time where it's increasingly important to migrate as fast as possible to PQC. So where the U.S. can really step forward and transparently share what their transition strategy looks like at the agency level, for example, early and often communicating with critical infrastructure. There's so much learnings that we can have, I think, from previous cyber issues to be able to drive this forward a lot faster. And we're all, I think, very aware of the risks, but the timeline is being pulled up. And so how we can support policymakers, through private-public partnership, through industry, and driving that forward, I think will be really important.
So on the point of where and how the US should lead, where and how should the US lead in shaping global norms and standards for quantum technologies? And also, where is strategic competition inevitable? Do you think it's inevitable?
I can start with this. I mean, ideally, we'd lead everywhere. And I mean, strategic competition, I think there will be competition at like every sector of quantum. Sorry for talking with my hands and moving the mic with it. But I think something that we would need to emphasize in order to be a leader in quantum is international cooperation. We've seen a rise in like tech sovereignty initiatives, and I think that part of that is in response to some of our policies, including tariffing our allies. And I think I see from my personal perspective, when I go around to different countries and different customers, I see an eagerness to engage with the US and engage with a strong ally. But there is this hesitation of, will we support them back? And I think that, a global support, maybe we tariff you on rice, but for this global security issue, we're on the same team. And so that's my sense of how we can be a leader, because people really are excited to work with the US and US companies and US products and allied products in the quantum space. I think there is a global understanding of, the threat and us all needing to work together in order to combat, geopolitical threats.
And I think too, building off of Jasmine, two opportunities for international collaboration, especially amongst like-minded allies who have a similar view of what our quantum future could look like. First, standards development as an example, right? We're very early in the standards conversation as it relates to quantum, but we do have a need for at least a common way of talking about quantum, a common way of benchmarking quantum progress. And I think that's a real opportunity for the US to collaborate with like-minded countries on how can we drive forward similar terminology even in these very early standards conversation. That's a place where the US can both lead but also partner in a way that we can kind of shape what future standards look like. The second, which I feel like is often one of the more cited examples for collaboration, is talent. I mean, talent when it comes to quantum innovation. We need the best and brightest minds, and that requires having access to a global talent pool. And so while, strategic, competition might be inevitable, on talent specifically, collaboration is extremely necessary. We're at this pivotal moment in the technologies developed where it's very clear that we have kind of a collective shared success in the global quantum race, and where we can collaborate on talent, I think, is going to be increasingly important.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to add a couple of comments to both Jasmine and Emily's. I mean, completely agree. And, to your question, Samir, specifically about, is strategic competition inevitable? I mean, it is. And I mean, I think, the elephant in the room or whatever is, there's a lot of focus on US-China strategic competition in technology areas like AI and quantum and semiconductors, and I think the reality is that when we look at what the policy actions have been the past several years to address some of those very legitimate issues, too often, I think it's just, let's just quote unquote keep our technology here, or by doing things like erecting export controls, which again have their place, but if export controls are too broad in areas like quantum, it's going to be very difficult to achieve the types of international collaboration that we're all talking about here. I mean, so I think that the US government and other governments, Europe and everywhere else, really need to think of, quantum and quantum policy making through the lens of, how can we kind of form, strategic, alliances of like-minded, democratic allies and partners on these things, so that, because it's going to be very different. It's just going to certainly slow down all of the promise of developing quantum if we do not have, if we're putting up too many hurdles to the free movement of data, technologies, IP, and people. And so that, there has to be a way to kind of optimize for both. And I think the way to do that is, as opposed to super broad controls in some of these areas like export controls, just really targeted controls, and then also kind of forming these alliances or partnerships, plurilateral groups that are going to, not, again, someone yesterday mentioned something like a, free quantum development, economic development zone or something like that. I don't know if that's practical or not, but I appreciate the thinking behind it.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
I think the last thing is to see ourselves as a leader, because I think other people do. I mean, literally, I have had customers from other countries ask me, please make this thing for us, because we want to buy from you. We want to buy American. We want to buy Allied. And we don't want to have to buy the alternative, which I'm going to keep anonymous for this session, but we don't want to buy the alternative. And so I think already seeing ourselves as leaders is also important, and internalizing that people want to work with us and see us that way. So that's my conclusion.
I do have one final question before we wrap up, but I do want to check with the audience if there are any questions. All right, I guess I can go ahead and ask my final question. So if each of you had one piece of advice for federal policymakers who are hopefully in the room today to ensure US quantum leadership by 2030, what would it be? Let's start with Emily.
Thanks. I would say that private-public partnerships are our nation's superpower, and collaboration with industry. We have this fantastic trifecta in the U.S. that has been so powerful historically, right? When we bring together government, industry, and academia, we are really able to accomplish a ton, and I think we can really pull forward our own timeline when we're able to do that. So that's a piece of advice number one. And the second is, now is the moment. We've shown so much progress across U.S. industry in the past 18 months. Now is the moment to accelerate. Think about how we can partner and fully fund critical government programs that are key to building a utility-scale quantum computer.
Jasmine?
How we can be a leader by 2030. I feel like I would like to see, DARPA QBI was a good start, but I would like to see the U.S. put some more of its full weight behind quantum development. And I think part of going a layer deeper behind that is actually policymaker education. Because, in the words of my first quantum professor, like the first fully fledged quantum computer can hack everything in the world, which is a little sensationalist, and not 100% accurate, but it can break most encryption. And I think when people find out about that, I haven't met anyone who has been nonchalant about hearing that a quantum computer can break almost all the encryption. And I found that many lay people and many policymakers, unless their focus includes quantum or emerging technology, they don't even know that this exists. So I feel like part of the engagement is actually policymaker education, whether that's just more conversations, more, sharing with colleagues, or something else. I'm sure other people have more efficient, good ideas, but I think the education or a deeper understanding of what quantum actually impacts and why it matters can help us be a leader on a policy scale. Yeah.
Joan, you have the last word.
Thanks, Samir. I guess I will really double down on or maybe I'm tripling down on underscoring the importance of partnerships, both with industry and with international allies and partners. I used export controls as an example to illustrate some of the challenges when we try to go it alone with unilateral controls. Could have easily, used supply chain as well, right? I'm not even sure. There's people in the room who know better than I do how many components, go into a, quantum computer, currently, but I know it's in the thousands, and in the future it's going to be a lot, tens of thousands. And we're not going to make all of those components in the United States. Vertically integrated supply chains in this area are just, we shouldn't aspire to them. And, even though we want to incentivize domestic production of various different things, we are not going to be able to do this alone, either as a single government or as industry or anyone else. So we really need to work together to again just try to optimize the policy environment to match up with the reality of from a technology standpoint and what it's going to take to achieve the quantum computer that we're all aspiring to here. So, thanks.
And on that, thank you very much for joining us for this conversation.